The early morning air in the valley carried the sharp, clean scent of damp cedar and late autumn earth, the kind of stillness that does not simply exist around a person, but actively settles into the hollows of a bruised spirit. Julian stood on the sagging porch of his grandfather's old timber cabin, watching the blue-gray mist coil slowly through the pine tops, like smoke from an invisible fire. For nearly a decade, he had lived inside the frantic, neon-lit pulse of the city, running on the brittle fuel of ambition and the unspoken fear that stopping, even for a moment, meant falling apart entirely. But the body remembers what the mind tries to deny, and when the exhaustion finally cracked his ribs, he had driven north without a plan. Driven until the asphalt gave way to rutted gravel, and the gravel turned into the quiet sanctuary of forgotten hills. Here, time moved to a different cadence altogether, unhurried, heavy with the patient wisdom of granite, oak, and moss. Looking out across the untamed clearing, where wild blackberries clung stubbornly to the weathered fence, Julian felt the first faint thaw in a heart that had been frozen solid by years of endless striving. The house behind him smelled of dry pine, old wool blankets, and dried lavender hanging from the rafters, a fragrance preserved like a gentle promise across decades of silence. He pulled his coat closer, took his first deep breath in months, and let the cold air settle into his lungs, realizing, with a quiet shock, that he was safe. Stepping inside the small living room, Julian walked toward the sturdy oak workbench that stood beside the stone fireplace, its surface mapped with decades of small scratches and faded ink stains. His grandfather, Arthur, had been a master joiner who believed that every piece of wood possessed an internal truth, a secret grain that only patience could reveal to human hands. Sitting at the center of the desk was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft and dark by the oils of a working man's touch. Julian extended a tentative hand, his fingers tracing the faint, embossed initials on the spine before gently turning the yellowed pages. Arthur's handwriting was precise and unhurried, flowing like water over river stones, recording not merely the dimensions of tables and chairs, but quiet meditations on life, grief, and the art of rebuilding what had been shattered. On a page dated 40 years prior, written during the long winter after Julian's grandmother had passed away, his grandfather had penned a single line that seemed to illuminate the dim room. The grain does not fight the storm that grew it. It simply turns the wind into strength and the scar into grace. Reading those words, a heavy lump formed in Julian's throat, sharp with years of suppressed sorrow. He rested his palms flat against the table and closed his eyes, realizing how long he had fought his own storms, trying to erase every flaw, completely unaware that his wounds were not evidence of failure, but the very foundation upon which his genuine life could finally be built. A gentle tap at the kitchen door broke the stillness, accompanied by the muffled, rhythmic thud of a heavy wooden cane against the porch floorboards. Julian opened the door to find Samuel, an old family friend and neighboring farmer whose face was a landscape of deep, sun-etched lines and whose eyes held the quiet kindness of someone who had seen every season come and go. Samuel carried a wicker basket filled with fresh apples, warm sourdough bread, and a jar of clover honey, offering them with a silent nod that required no formal explanation or polite pretense. I saw smoke rising from the chimney for the first time in 3 years, Samuel said, his voice low and resonant, like dry leaves turning in an autumn breeze. Thought you might be hungry, son. Your grandfather always said this cabin knew when a soul needed mending. The old man walked over to the hearth, adding 2 thick logs of dried maple to the embers, until a warm, golden glow spilled across the room. They sat together in a comfortable silence that felt entirely natural, drinking bitter tea brewed from wild mint. Samuel didn't press Julian for reasons or ask why he looked so hollowed out by the world. Instead, he simply spoke of the weather, the apple harvest, and how the forest always renews itself after a hard freeze. In that quiet companionship, Julian felt the suffocating isolation of his recent years begin to loosen, replaced by the simple, profound comfort of being seen without needing to perform, explain, or pretend to be anything other than himself. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, casting long amber ribbons across the wooden floor, Samuel took his leave, leaving Julian alone once more with the crackling fire and his own awakening heart. Stepping back onto the porch, Julian walked down the steps and stood in the center of the overgrown yard, feeling the damp soil beneath the soles of his boots. For years, he had operated under the unspoken delusion that life was a mountain to be conquered, a high peak where safety existed only at the summit of perfect achievement. But looking at the towering hemlocks and the quiet river winding through the valley floor, he understood that grace was not found at the top of a climb, but in the willingness to descend into the fertile valley of one's own vulnerability. The tears he had kept locked away behind a mask of competence finally broke free, warm and unbidden, washing away the toxic dust of chronic anxiety. He did not cry out of despair, but out of a sudden, overwhelming relief. The realization that he no longer had to carry the crushing weight of who he thought he was supposed to be. In the stillness of the afternoon, the wind whispered through the pines, sounding less like a warning and more like an invitation to belong to the earth again. He let the tears fall without shame, feeling each drop act as a quiet cleansing, a baptism in the gentle truth that he was already enough, just as he stood. By early evening, a brilliant canopy of stars began to bloom across the clear mountain sky, shining with a sharp, ancient clarity that made the world feel vastly larger and infinitely kinder. Julian walked to the edge of the woods and knelt near an old, neglected apple tree, its branches gnarled, yet still bearing a few stubborn, sweet fruit. He picked up a fallen apple, pressed its smooth skin against his palm, and felt a profound sense of reconnection to the rhythm of seed, soil, and harvest. He picked up a rusty garden trowel resting by the fence post, cleared away a patch of choked weeds around the base of the trunk, and turned the dark earth, feeling the cool dirt between his fingers. It was a tiny, unremarkable gesture. Yet, to Julian, It marked the solemn beginning of a new covenant with his own life. A commitment to tend rather than to push, to nurture rather than to extract. The ghost of who he used to be seemed to dissolve into the twilight, leaving behind a man ready to learn the patient art of living again. Tomorrow, he would begin repairing the fence and sanding down the workbench in the cabin. But tonight, he was content simply to stand beneath the vast sky, listening to the owl call through the dark trees. He smiled for the first time in years, feeling a deep, steady peace take root within him, knowing that the journey home had finally begun. The old wooden cottage at the edge of coastal Maine stood wrapped in a blanket of early September mist, its weathered shingles silvered by decades of salt spray and relentless wind. Stepping across the threshold into the quiet hallway, Julian felt the sudden, heavy weight of his own history, pressing down upon his chest like an unspoken confession. For years, he had run from this stillness, busying his hands in the frantic churn of city life, convincing himself that momentum was the same thing as moving forward. Yet, standing in the cold, ambient light of the living room, where white bedsheets covered the furniture like sleeping ghosts, he realized that escape had only been a delay of the inevitable. The air tasted faintly of cedar, dry paper, and the sharp tang of the ocean just beyond the bluff, a sensory tapestry that instantly unlocked memories he had carefully buried. He did not immediately pull back the covers or open the creaking shutters. Instead, he simply sat on the edge of a bare wooden chair and allowed the quiet to settle into his bones. The silence was not hostile, though it possessed a formidable weight, demanding an honesty he had spent a decade avoiding. Outside, the steady rhythm of waves crashing against granite cliffs echoed like a slow, patient pulse, reminding him that the world continued to breathe, even when his own heart felt brittle and stalled. In that vulnerable twilight between past regrets and an unwritten future, he took his first deep breath in years, finally surrendering to the quiet work of arriving where he was. By the third morning, the solitude began to shift from an overwhelming vacuum into a wide, open canvas, interrupted only by the creak of the back porch door when Clara arrived. She was an elderly woman from down the lane, whose face was lined like dry creek beds, carrying a chipped enamel basket filled with fresh plums and warm sourdough bread. She did not ask Julian why he had returned after so many years, nor did she offer unsolicited pity for the hollow shadow behind his eyes. Instead, she merely sat on the steps, wiping flour from her knuckles while looking out toward the hazy line where sea met sky. In her presence, there was no need for performance or defensive explanations, only a shared appreciation for the simple physics of morning light filtering through pine needles. Things break down when we hold them too tight, she observed casually, her voice like soft gravel, as she split a plum in half and handed him a piece. Her words were not framed as grand wisdom, but as an obvious truth of nature, akin to how tides retreat to gather strength before rising again. As Julian chewed the sweet, tart fruit, he felt a subtle crack in the frozen armor he had worn around his grief. Clara's quiet acceptance reminded him that humanity's greatest act of mercy was not fixing what was broken in one another, but sitting beside someone in their shattered ruins until they remembered how to build again. In that small, ordinary gesture of shared bread and silence, the heavy isolation that had anchored his soul began to loosen its grip. That afternoon, sitting at his father's old oak desk, overlooking the gray expanse of the bay, Julian opened a wooden box he had left untouched for over a decade. Inside lay yellowed letters, unsent notes, and photographs of a life before fracture. A mirror reflecting a man who had demanded absolute perfection from himself, and broken when reality fell short. For years, he had carried his mistakes like lead weights, mistaking self-punishment for responsibility, believing that to heal meant forgetting the wounds entirely. But as he ran his thumb across the rough grain of the desk, feeling the faint grooves etched by his late father's workshop tools, a profound realization washed over him with the force of an oncoming tide. Growth was not the smooth elimination of scars, but the slow, stubborn capacity to carry them without letting them define the boundaries of one's spirit. Tears came then, not in a violent tempest of anger, but like a long-awaited spring rain, softening soil that had been baked hard by drought. He wept for the younger version of himself who had fought so fiercely with no weapons, for the years lost to bitterness, and for the fragile beauty of being utterly human. In the soft glow of the declining sun, he wrote a single line on a clean sheet of paper. "I forgive you for not knowing how to survive until now." The simple phrase acted as a key turning in a long, rusted lock, releasing the tight grip of past failure and allowing a quiet, warm mercy to fill the hollow spaces inside his chest. The following week was marked by the tangible rhythm of physical labor, as Julian set about repairing the neglected cottage with a deliberate, prayerful focus. He spent his days sanding down the rough, sun-bleached floorboards, replacing rotted cedar shingles, and repainting the weathered trim in crisp, clean white. There was something profoundly therapeutic about the tactile work, the sharp scent of fresh sawdust lingering in the cool autumn air, the rhythmic scrape of the scraper against old, peeling paint, and the steady hum of a hand plane smoothing out stubborn knots in hemlock timber. Each movement of his body felt like a physical declaration that he was no longer willing to let decay have the final word. He worked until his arms throbbed with a healthy, satisfying ache, and his palms bore new calluses, finding in this humble restoration a mirror for his own internal renewal. When he fixed the latch on the front door so it closed with a clear, solid click, he felt an unexpected surge of pride that he hadn't experienced in a decade. He was not merely restoring a structure of wood and nail. He was reconstituting the architecture of his own life, piece by deliberate piece. Every nail driven into sound wood became an anchor, grounding him in the present moment, replacing the phantom anxieties of what might have been with the quiet reality of what was being built right before his eyes. Labor had stripped away the paralysis of overthinking, leaving in its place a grounded, enduring strength that felt entirely genuine and hard-won. On his final morning at the coast, Julian stood on the newly sanded wooden porch as dawn broke across the Atlantic in vibrant sweeps of amber and rose gold. The air was crisp and laden with the clean, invigorating promise of late autumn, carrying the distant laughter of gulls soaring high above the roaring surf. Looking out over the shimmering, expansive ocean, he realized he no longer viewed his entire life through the narrow prism of past heartbreak, but through the limitless expanse of quiet possibility. He was returning to the world not as a broken man who had simply escaped his pain, but as one who had integrated it, converting heavy sorrow into an enduring wellspring of quiet empathy and wisdom. Healing, he understood now, did not mean the complete absence of storm clouds on the horizon. It meant learning how to navigate the rough waters with a steady hand and an unshakable faith in the light that always follows the dark. He packed his small leather bag, placed the spare key under the flower pot for Clara, and walked down the gravel driveway toward his car with an unhurried, deeply grounded stride. The open road stretched ahead like a welcoming invitation, winding through forested hills toward new beginnings and deeper human connections. As the morning sun crested the pine tree line, illuminating the winding path forward in brilliant gold, Julian smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that radiated from the very center of his renewed soul. He was finally ready to live fully again, anchored in grace, holding his past gently, and walking forward with an open, resilient heart into the beautiful unknown. Morning came not with a dramatic burst of gold, but with a quiet, pearlescent unfurling across the frost-silvered valley, as if the universe itself were treading softly, so as not to disturb the fragile sanctuary we had built from the ruins of our former lives. Standing on the battered cedar porch, wrapping my fingers around a ceramic mug whose heat felt like a tender promise, I watched the mist drift through the bare branches of the orchard. Trees that had survived the harshest winter in living memory, only to bloom with a tentative, persistent grace. For years, I had treated pain like a spectral intruder, barricading every door against its chill, refusing to acknowledge that the ghosts we flee are often just forgotten fragments of ourselves, longing to come home. But standing there in the amber stillness of dawn, feeling the crisp, pine-scented air expand within my chest, I understood that healing does not require the erased memory of the storm. It simply asks that we stop fighting the weather. The silence between us, which once felt like a chasm carved by unspoken regrets and withered expectations, had slowly transformed into something spacious and forgiving. An open clearing where two bruised souls could sit without the burden of defense. Every timber of this old house, worn smooth by decades of weather and quiet endurance, seemed to whisper that beauty is rarely found in pristine, untouched surfaces, but in the places where life has pressed hard enough to leave a mark, carving channels through which empathy and grace can finally flow freely. We spent the late morning clearing out the old workbench in the barn, a ritual that felt less like chores and more like a quiet liturgy of release. For years, those dust-laden shelves had harbored broken tools, rusted nails, and discarded projects left half-finished when anger choked out our patience. Layer by layer, we swept away cobwebs and grime, uncovering forgotten objects. A brass compass, a wooden carving of a swallow, a pair of worn leather gloves that still retained the shape of my father's hard-working hands. As I held those gloves, feeling the grain of weathered hide beneath my fingertips, the tight knot of bitterness that had lived in my sternum for a decade began to soften, dissolving into a gentle, aching reverence. Forgiveness, I realized as we carried debris out to the clearing, is not a grand, singular gesture performed under a spotlight. It is the small, unglamorous labor of sweeping the floor, of setting down heavy stones you are never meant to carry forever. Each item we sorted was a testament to a moment when life demanded more than we thought we could give. Yet here we were, still standing, still breathing in cool, earth-scented air. When we ignited the brush fire, watching blue smoke curl upward into the endless sky, it felt as though burdens of long-held grudges were converted into light and ash, leaving behind an empty space no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what might now take root in the fertile ground unfolding before us. By late afternoon, as twilight painted the horizon in shades of soft plum and dusky gold, we sat together at the kitchen table over 2 mugs of warm chamomile tea and a loaf of crusty, freshly baked bread. In the past, mealtime had often been an exercise in guarded tension, where every word was weighed for hidden meanings, and every silence felt like an armed truce. But now, as the yellow glow of the pendant lamp illuminated the grain of the worn oak tabletop, there was an unhurried, gentle grace in the way we shared food, passing the butter with quiet smiles that needed no performance. We talked not of the grand grievances or painful misunderstandings that had once torn our family apart, but of simple, human truths. How fast the seasons seemed to turn, how the old dog slept deeper these days, and how strange it was that grace often arrives only after you stop demanding perfection from the world. Looking across at my mother's face, tracing the delicate network of lines around her eyes, I saw not the formidable figure of my childhood who could never be pleased, but a vulnerable woman who had done her best with the broken tools she had been given by her own difficult past. In that quiet exchange of glances, a silent, profound agreement passed between us. We were agreeing to stop litigating history, choosing instead to love and honor the imperfect, resilient people sitting right in front of us in this quiet, beautiful, and deeply living present moment we now shared. Later that evening, after the house had settled into its nighttime rhythm and the soft breathing of sleep filled the quiet rooms, I walked down toward the river, where the black water glided silently beneath a canopy of brilliant, needle-sharp stars. The air was cold enough to turn my breath into pale ghosts that dissolved into the darkness. Yet inside my chest, a steady, unflickering warmth had taken root, radiant and entire. For so long, I had viewed the scars of my life, the failed dreams, the painful departures, the years spent wandering through the desert of self-doubt, as tragic detours away from the person I was supposed to become. But standing by the singing edge of the river, watching the starlight shimmer on the dark ripples, I saw with startling clarity that those very wounds were the chisel marks of my true shaping. Without the suffering that had cracked my ego open, I would have remained encased in hard, unyielding stone, immune to the suffering of others, and blind to the quiet miracles unfolding in everyday life. Life does not repair us by restoring us to our original form. Like the ancient Japanese craft of joining broken pottery with lacquer dusted with gold, it mends us at the fault lines, making the repaired places the most luminous and enduring parts of who we are. Our heartbreaks are not proofs of our failure, but the very credentials that allow us to step into the world with genuine mercy, offering a hand to those who are still stumbling in the dark. When the second morning arrived, bringing with it the crisp promise of a new season, I packed my small canvas bag and prepared to head back out into the wide, waiting world. No longer as a fugitive escaping from my history, but as an active participant, ready to embrace whatever comes. The road stretching ahead through the pine forests was long and uncertain, winding past unknown hills and unfamiliar valleys. Yet I felt no trace of the old, paralyzing dread that had once dictated my steps. I knew now that life does not offer guarantees of safety or immunity from sorrow, but it grants us something far more precious: the capacity to heal, to rebuild, and to love again, with a courage that is all the braver for having known defeat. To live fully is to step into the daylight with an open heart, trusting that the darkness we endure is never the final word, but merely the deep, quiet darkness of the soil before the seed breaks through toward the light. As I turned to wave goodbye to the old house, standing peaceful against the morning sky, I felt a profound gratitude for every tear shed, every mountain climbed, and every silent night spent yearning for answers. For in the end, we are not defined by how many times we fall or how deeply we are wounded, but by the quiet, unstoppable grace with which we rise, brush off the dust of yesterday, and walk forward into the infinite beauty of our unwritten, deeply hopeful, and luminous tomorrows. Returning to Crenshaw Avenue on Thursday morning, I pulled my work truck to the curb and stared in quiet disbelief at 2 folding tables arranged across the front lawn. Cardboard boxes lined the driveway, and a sign taped to the mailbox brazenly declared, "Yard sale. Everything must go." Victoria stood near the far table, wearing white linen and sunglasses, casually negotiating with a stranger over my late husband's ceramic mixing bowls. My chest tightened as I walked slowly toward the grass, passing Richard's orange-handled pipe wrenches, his spirit levels, and the engraved voltage tester Frank Delaney had gifted him upon retirement. At the far end of the second table lay a small cedar box, crafted by Richard in 1994, its brass latch catching the bright morning sun. Inside rested Richard's wedding band, Lucas's infant hospital bracelet, and handwritten love letters on yellow paper I had not opened since his funeral. "Oh, Audrey, we're just doing a little decluttering here," Victoria chimed with artificial cheerfulness. Before I could speak, my 72-year-old neighbor, Dolores Reyes, marched across the property line in her floral house dress, her jaw set with 50 years of authority. "That sacred box belongs to Richard's widow, and you have no right touching a dead man's memory," Dolores declared sharply, her eyes cutting through Victoria's polished facade. I picked up the cedar box, holding it tightly against my chest, like a sacred trust. Without acknowledging Victoria's flustered excuses, I walked inside, knowing that preserving love's physical anchors was my first major victory in fully reclaiming my own dignity. 2 days later, Victoria knocked gently on my bedroom door, offering a practiced smile and proposing an afternoon trip to Montage, an exclusive day spa in Beverly Hills. "I feel terrible about the yard sale misunderstanding, Audrey," she cooed softly, adjusting her expensive designer handbag. "Let me pamper you with a luxury massage, my treat, so we can spend real time together before the wedding." I agreed, wanting to observe her maneuverings directly. The spa was opulent, filled with polished marble, whispered conversations, and subtle eucalyptus scents. My stiff lower back, aching from long nights spent sleeping in the concrete storage room, welcomed the physical treatment, while my mind remained clear and analytical. Afterwards, as we sat in plush robes sipping cucumber water, a staff member quietly delivered a leather folder containing the bill, totaling $840. Victoria opened it, glanced at the receipt, and casually slid the folder across the marble table toward me. "Since you're staying in the house, I thought you'd want to handle this," she remarked smoothly. Looking into her expectant eyes, I folded my hands over my lap, speaking at a clear, measured volume that carried across the lounge. "You explicitly stated this was your treat, Victoria," I stated calmly. "I am not paying $840. If you cannot cover your bill, I suggest you call Brandon." Color drained from her face as reception staff turned in silence. Gathering my clothes with composed dignity, I stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, leaving her completely trapped in her shallow deceit. By Friday afternoon, real estate agent Greg Torres arrived to present a binding written cash offer for the Crenshaw residence. I stood near the backyard lemon tree, the tree Richard and I had planted together 23 years ago, holding its root ball while we debated proper depth, watching gentle sunlight filter through green leaves. "The buyers are Marcus and Denise Webb," Greg explained, handing me the buyer profile. "He's a mechanical engineer at JPL, and she's a pediatric nurse at Cedars-Sinai. They've been searching for 8 months, lost 3 bids to corporate investors, and are offering $850,000 cash with a fast 10-day close." I reviewed their personal letter, filled with sweet photographs of their 6-month-old daughter and heartfelt promises to cherish the garden with genuine care. Denise had specifically written, "When we saw the lemon tree in the backyard, we knew this wasn't just a physical structure. It was a home built with deep love." The offer matched current Los Angeles market valuations perfectly, but more importantly, it resonated with the living pulse of my late husband's memory, Brandon viewed our family home merely as a financial lever to impress Victoria's wealthy father. But this young working family recognized its true soul. Looking at the bright yellow fruit hanging from the sturdy branches, I felt a serene sense of completion wash over me. "Accept the offer without counter, Greg," I said softly, signing the purchase agreement with steady cursive penmanship. This house deserves to shelter people who understand that true value is measured in love, not arrogance. Early Saturday morning, my 19-year-old nephew Lucas pulled into the gravel driveway in his old white pickup truck, his face radiating humble character and quiet reliability. Lucas worked long weekend shifts at a local auto shop restoring vintage engines, possessing the exact same disciplined work ethic and unpretentious spirit that had always defined my late husband, Richard. "Where do we start, Aunt Audrey?" he asked, greeting me with a firm, affectionate embrace before carrying heavy wooden boxes from the storage room out to his truck bed. We worked together in comfortable rhythm, moving my personal engineering blueprints, books, and family archives without needing to fill the quiet silence with any idle chatter. At noon, as we sat together on the tailgate eating homemade sandwiches, Lucas walked over to the old lemon tree with sharp shears and small rooting containers. "Uncle Richard showed me how to graft fruit branches when I was 10, Lucas said softly, carefully cutting a healthy, resilient branch with green buds. He planted the sapling cutting into a ceramic pot filled with rich soil, securing it safely in the passenger cab beside the cedar memory box. "This cutting belongs on your new mountain balcony in the Santa Monica Mountains, Aunt Audrey," he added, his young eyes bright with wisdom. "Her roots will take hold up there, and she'll bloom again in the clean air." Watching Lucas tend that young sapling, my heart filled with overwhelming gratitude, realizing that true legacy lives not in bitter entitlement, but in the gentle hands of those who respect life's sacred continuity. Following the successful sale of the Crenshaw residence for $850,000, attorney Ray Connors finalized the financial transactions inside his office. After deducting $550,000 to purchase my new mountain sanctuary, $300,000 remained in liquid capital. Rather than hoarding the surplus wealth or allowing it to sit idle, I instructed Ray to establish an irrevocable educational and entrepreneurial trust designated for my nephew Lucas. Ray drafted the trust documents with meticulous precision, structuring the capital to fund Lucas's business dream of opening an independent vintage automotive restoration shop in Hawthorne. When I handed Lucas the formal trust agreement over coffee that evening, his hands trembled as he read his name listed as sole beneficiary. "Aunt Audrey, I can't accept this," Lucas whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You earned this money through decades of hard work." I placed my hand gently over his, looking into the honest eyes of a young man who asked for nothing, yet deserved everything. "Lucas, true wealth isn't meant to be clutched out of fear or spent on superficial status," I explained softly. "It is meant to build sturdy foundations for people who walk with genuine integrity. Brandon chose shortcuts and deceit, but you chose honest labor and loyalty. You are Richard's true spiritual heir, and this trust is the foundation for your future." As Lucas embraced me warmly, I felt a deep, healing warmth settle into my spirit, knowing that justice was not merely about punishing greed, but about generously nurturing the righteous. The kitchen window caught the early autumn light, refracting it into soft amber pools that spilled across the worn wooden floorboards. For so many years, mornings had felt like a summons to a trial, a rigid demand to account for every misstep and unfinished dream. But today, the silence of the house was not heavy. It was a companionable hush, filled with the steady, reassuring hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic drip of the faucet. He stood with his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, feeling the warmth seep through his palms, anchoring him to the exact center of now. He had spent a lifetime trying to outrun the echoes of his hometown, believing that geography could cure a fractured spirit. Yet, standing here in this quiet corner of the world, he understood that healing was never about escaping the landscape of your grief. It was about learning to walk through those shadows until they no longer owned your stride. The coffee tasted of earth and toasted grain, simple and grounding. Outside, the maple leaves were turning a brilliant, defiant copper, letting go of the branches with a graceful surrender that defied the approaching cold. He watched a single leaf spiral down, untroubled by where it would land. In that fleeting descent, he recognized his own story, not as a tragedy of lost years, but as a long, winding preparation for this exact breath of grace. The past was no longer a ghost haunting the hallway. It was simply the foundation upon which he had built a quiet sanctuary. Later that afternoon, the sunlight shifted across the porch, casting long, geometric shadows over the rocking chair where his mother used to sit. For decades, words between them had been heavy stones dropped into a deep well, splashing briefly before sinking into cold obscurity. They had guarded their grievances like prized heirlooms, passing them back and forth until the edges were dangerously sharp. But healing demanded a different kind of courage. The willingness to lay down the armor and admit that being right mattered far less than being whole. He thought of the letter resting on his desk, sealed and stamped, containing no accusations or demands for apology, only a simple acknowledgement of shared human frailty. It was an offering of peace, written in ink that had dried hours ago, waiting for the mailbox flag to rise. Relationships were not restored overnight, like repaired pottery. They mended slowly, like bone knitting back together beneath the skin, through invisible, patient grace. He realized that forgiving someone else was never about condoning their past actions. It was about unhooking your heart from their mistakes so you could finally breathe freely. The wind picked up, carrying the crisp scent of pine and damp earth from the woods behind the yard. He felt a sudden, profound lightness in his chest, as if a door that had rusted shut for half a lifetime had finally clicked open. The distance between who he had been and who he was becoming no longer felt unbridgeable, because love, in its quiet, persistent way, had filled the deep gap. Evening brought a gentle twilight that painted the sky in shades of bruised violet and burning gold. He walked down the main street of the small town, nodding to shopkeepers who had watched him grow from a restless boy into an equally restless man. For the first time, their gazes did not feel like a judgment or a reminder of old failures. They felt like a quiet recognition of endurance. He stopped by the community garden, where old Mr. Henderson was pruning the late tomato vines, their green, pungent aroma hanging thick in the cooling air. Instead of rushing past, as he usually did, trapped in the anxious machinery of his own thoughts, he paused and offered to help gather the stray tools scattered across the damp earth. Mr. Henderson looked up, his weathered face breaking into a web of warm wrinkles, and handed him a pair of worn shears. In that simple exchange of labor and silence, a profound truth settled into his bones. Purpose was not something grand discovered on a distant mountaintop, but something quietly stitched together in the service of ordinary neighbors. We are all tethered to one another by invisible threads of vulnerability and hope, each person carrying a private burden they strive to conceal. By lightening someone else's load, even in the smallest way, his own heavy pack felt strangely manageable. The town church bell rang out across the valley, marking the close of day with a mellow chime. He smiled, knowing he finally belonged in this quiet corner of the wide world today. Returning home under a sky pricked with early stars, he unlocked his front door and stepped into the familiar warmth of his living room. The house smelled faintly of roasted coffee and old paper, a comforting signature of his solitary yet peaceful existence. He sank into his favorite armchair, letting out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to release the last lingering tensions of a difficult era. For so long, he'd measured his worth by productivity, by how many obstacles he could conquer, or how perfectly he could orchestrate his destiny. But true resilience, he now understood, was not about an unyielding armor that never cracked. It was about the tenderness with which you tended to your wounds when the armor failed. He reached for a worn leather journal lying on the side table, opening to a blank page, where the white expanse invited honesty rather than perfection. With a steady hand, he wrote down a single sentence, acknowledging his journey, forgiving himself for every detour, miscalculation, and dark night of the soul. Gentle compassion was a quiet revolution, a refusal to treat your own heart as an adversary. He looked out the window at the silver moonlight washing over the lawn, painting the world in shades of gentle gray and luminous hope. He no longer feared the silence or the empty spaces in his calendar, because those spaces were no longer voids of loneliness, but fertile ground where new dreams could finally take root and blossom into the vibrant reality he had always hoped to live each day. Tomorrow would bring its own array of small tasks and unforeseen turns, but tonight belonged entirely to peace. He stepped out onto the front porch once more, wrapping a thick wool blanket around his shoulders as a brisk autumn breeze rustled the canopy above. The stars burned with a brilliant, steady clarity, indifferent to human worries, yet somehow offering an expansive sense of belonging to something much larger than himself. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, fresh, pine-scented air, and smiled into the darkness. Every broken promise, every tear shed in solitude, and every stumble along the rocky road had brought him precisely to this threshold of grace. He was not finished growing, for life was a continuous unfolding of discovery. But he was finally at home in his own skin. The road ahead stretched out into the unknown, no longer terrifying, but shimmering with infinite possibility and quiet promise. He looked up at the vast, bright, starry sky and whispered a silent word of gratitude for the journey, for the pain that had taught him compassion, and for the dawn that was waiting patiently just beyond the horizon. The night folded around him like a warm embrace, whispering that no matter what storms lay ahead, his spirit was anchored, resilient, and eternally free to begin again with a radiant courage that would never fade into darkness, because he had finally learned how to carry his own light through every season of his remarkable life in this beautiful and unbroken world, today and forevermore. The morning frost clung to the weathered boards of the old front porch like whispered secrets from a winter that had overstayed its welcome. Arthur sat there quietly, with a lukewarm mug of black coffee between his palms, feeling the familiar ache in his joints, a quiet reminder of the seasons he had fought against rather than lived through. For years, he had treated his memories as trespassers, locking the doors and pulling the heavy velvet drapes against the harsh light of accountability. Yet, looking out over the misty expanse of the valley, where the goldenrod bent low under the heavy dew, he understood the ultimate futility of such barricades. The landscape did not apologize for its barren winters. It simply waited, patient and enduring, for the soil to warm beneath a stubborn sun. He reached down to touch the deep scar across his knuckle, tracing the jagged line, not with bitterness, but with a strange, burgeoning tenderness. It was the physical record of a collision, yes, but it was also proof that bone and sinew had mended, that the human body possessed a profound, silent wisdom of its own. He realized that the ghosts he feared were not monsters haunting the dark, but fragments of his own orphaned grace, waiting in the cold simply to be invited inside, offered a warm seat by the hearth, and thanked for the arduous journey they had forced him to take. The shift within him was as imperceptible as the turning of autumn leaves, happening not in a sudden flash of blinding revelation, but through the slow, accumulating weight of quiet grace. He thought of the younger version of himself, that desperate, restless soul who had wandered across state lines with a hollow chest and hands clenched into perpetual fists. For decades, Arthur had carried a silent fury toward that boy, blaming him for every misstep, every broken promise, every lonely night spent staring at cheap motel ceilings. But sitting here, in the absolute stillness of the morning, a profound wave of forgiveness washed over him, sweeping away the heavy sediment of self-loathing. That boy had not been failing maliciously. He had merely been terrified, navigating an unfamiliar world without a map or compass, doing the absolute best he could with the broken tools he had inherited. Arthur laid his hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart, and whispered an internal absolution into the crisp air. We are all, he realized. Clumsy architects trying to build cathedrals out of driftwood and doubt. To heal was not to erase the ruins of the past, but to walk among them with an open lantern, seeing the raw beauty in the exposed rafters, and finally recognizing that the storms which had threatened to tear him apart had also cleared the dense, choking underbrush to let the true light pour in. Down the quiet gravel road, past the rows of sleeping maples, the faint chime of the village church bell drifted across the open fields, calling the community to another ordinary day. Arthur watched as Martha, his neighbor of 20 years, wheeled her wooden cart down toward the garden, her movements deliberate and unhurried. There was a time when he would have retreated inside at the mere sight of another human being, preferring the cold safety of isolation to the unpredictable vulnerability of connection. But today, something in his posture softened. He stood up, the old floorboards groaning beneath his boots, and walked down the steps to meet her at the wooden fence line. They exchanged no grand philosophies, no dramatic confessions of soul-searching. Instead, they spoke of the summer drought, the stubborn squash bugs, and the sweet tartness of the late-season apples. In that casual, unpretentious exchange, Arthur felt deeply anchored to the earth again. Human love and neighborly fellowship were not grand theatrical productions. They were found in the shared silence between sentences, in the quiet passing of a wicker basket filled with fresh produce, and in the unspoken understanding that everyone around you was carrying an invisible burden of their own. By sharing the mundane weight of the morning, the world felt less vast and indifferent, and infinitely more like a warm home he never knew he was truly allowed to inhabit. Returning to the porch, Arthur felt the warm afternoon sun break fully through the lingering haze, casting a golden, amber glow over the worn wooden floorboards. He picked up his pocket knife and a small piece of cedar wood he had kept in his jacket pocket for weeks, beginning to carve with slow, deliberate strokes. The wood was resistant at first, fighting back against the blade with tough knots and stubborn grain, mirroring the resistance he had felt inside his own spirit for so long. Yet, as he applied steady, patient pressure rather than forcing the cut, the wood yielded, revealing a smooth, fragrant core beneath the rough exterior. It was a quiet meditation on time and surrender. For too long, he had tried to dictate the exact shape of his life, demanding perfection from an inherently messy and unpredictable existence. Now, sitting beneath the vast, indifferent expanse of the autumn sky, he felt a profound release of control. The future did not need to be mapped out in meticulous detail. It was enough to tend to the immediate inch of ground beneath his feet, to breathe in the crisp scent of pine and damp earth, and to trust that whatever came next would find him ready. Life was not a puzzle to be solved, or a battle to be won, but a vast canvas of light and shadow, waiting only for the courage of an open heart to let its true colors emerge. As twilight began to paint the western horizon in rich shades of bruised violet and soft amber, Arthur set his wooden carving aside and stood quietly at the edge of the porch, looking out toward the distant hills. The day was drawing to its natural close, carrying away the ghosts of yesterday and the anxious blueprints of tomorrow, leaving behind only the sacred quiet of the present moment. He felt immeasurably lighter, as though a heavy winter coat he had worn through years of blizzards had finally slipped from his shoulders and dissolved into the dust. Healing was not the absence of scars, he understood now, but the hard-won capacity to carry them without bitterness, to let them serve as windows rather than impenetrable walls. The world was still full of uncertainties, and the road ahead certainly held its share of unwritten winters, but he no longer feared the cold. He possessed a new warmth within, kindled by forgiveness, anchored by community, and sustained by the quiet beauty of ordinary days. Turning back toward the screen door, where the golden light of a small lamp beckoned from inside, Arthur took a deep, steady breath and stepped across the threshold. He was home at last, not merely in a physical place, but within the deep, unbroken sanctuary of his own reconciled soul, ready to greet whatever gentle dawn was waiting for him on the other side of the dark.